Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jess Hathaway with Ocean Strategies, and I'm delighted to have with me here today Brenda Asuncion, meeting with us from Hawaii. Brenda is the Mālama Loko Ia coordinator for Kua'aina Ulu Auamo, or otherwise known as KUA, which is a nonprofit organization working to advance community-based natural resources management in Hawaii by restoring Hawaiian communities' traditional role as caretakers of their lands and waters. Brenda's primary kuleana, or responsibility, is to coordinate with the Mālama Loko Ia, a network of more than 60 Loko Ia, which are traditional fish ponds across Hawaii, and provide opportunities for Loko Ia practitioners to collaborate and increase their collective restoration efforts. Brenda is based on the island of Oahu, and she received her bachelor's in biology with a marine biology emphasis from Occidental College and a master's in marine science from Hawaii Pacific University. And in 2016, Brenda was named one of Pacific Business News 40 Under 40. And I'm also, I have had the pleasure of meeting Brenda in person in Hawaii in January of this year. And it's so nice to see you again, Brenda. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice seeing you.
I'm really excited to talk about your work restoring traditional Hawaiian community seafood practices. But for an icebreaker today, I'm going to start with our standard. What is your favorite seafood and how do you prepare it?
This was a hard one. I think because it's coming around this season, it's early March now, and around April, the kind of like Chinese side of my family does this tradition of bringing food to the graveyards to like feed the ancestors, and there has to be a vegetable dish, a fish dish, duck eggs, like a pork dish. And the fish dish that we always make is like with a bonefish, and we make fish cakes with water chestnut and vegetables in it. And so I think just because it's on my mind, we're gonna be doing that in the next month or so. That's kind of like a seafood something that I'm looking forward to. So for the season, that's gonna be my favorite seafood preparation right now.
That sounds amazing and like nothing I've ever had before, which I don't think anyone has ever done for me when I ask about their favorite preparation. That sounds spectacular. Do you want to share a little bit about what that means?
I think it's just because it's like made for an occasion. Um, it it's something that, has memories attached to it and has like a family tradition attached to it. So yeah.
Yeah,
So for us at least, it is a seasonal thing.
makes sense. Yeah, that sounds really good. I would love to learn more about that. Offline, we will go over that and maybe we can find some recipes to
Yeah,
share.
yeah, that sounds good.
So, can you walk us through a little bit of an overview of the history of Loko Ia in Hawaii and what lessons other seafood and community leaders can learn from the practice?
Loko in the Hawaiian language means like inside or within. So it's like a directional word, but so when you think of it as loko ia, and ia is the word for fish or really any food grown in the ocean or from the ocean. Loko ia, people think of it as these fish ponds. But um the function of Loko extended not just along the nearshore coastline areas, but also up in the watersheds. And so fish were grown in conjunction with wetland agriculture as well, and kind of in seasonal ponds along streams, or um, the most well-known system is along the coastlines, in association with freshwater sources. So either alongside a stream or kind of near groundwater seeps or springs. And so really they are in these coastal forms, they enhance the estuary environment, and um, really the infrastructure of the pond, which was typically with rock walls or kind of enhancements of natural sand berms or using coral if it was in a region with a lot of coral. Um, that enclosure was kind of just to enhance that productive estuary area. So it would enhance the growing of really good phytoplankton for herbivorous fish. So typically fish ponds were to enhance the growth and cultivation of herbivorous fish. And the kind of rise of fish pond construction throughout the islands is associated with a phase of population growth. And a lot of times also we can think about fish pond construction and maintenance as reflections of the traditional land and resource management structures in Hawaii. So local land managers and chiefs would kind of commission the construction of fish ponds, and um, the general population living in those areas would contribute to the construction and maintenance of fish ponds. Um, and so nowadays, the other part of your question, kind of like what lessons can be learned, um, it's really interesting to think about how this practice applies to our communities today, because they really were kind of public works projects and um, ways to enhance public resources of the ocean and water, um, but um, kind of at the direction of leaders in the community and with the cooperation and contribution of all the members of a community. And so in that way, it's kind of cool to think about how we could apply those ideas about a communal food system to our communities today, and what does it mean for people to revive these systems in Hawaii, and have buy-in and contribute to them and be able to benefit from them in ways that still fit in our, political and social structures today. So I think it's just those lessons of like communal contributions, public resources, effective leadership. Um, those are all kind of like broad concepts that we can learn actually from fish ponds. And then maybe one other thing is that because the coastal ones in particular were at they're really at the border of the land and the ocean. They really were affected by things that happened on the land and the way that we manage our freshwater resources, and also the way that our fisheries are managed, because ponds were naturally stocked. So juveniles would be recruited in just by the behavior of fish to recruit to the shoreline.
This got me thinking about population growth, responses to population growth, and in Western culture, a lot of times what we've done in coastal communities is fill in those estuarine areas. Historically, I mean, less so now, hopefully, but this is the opposite of that. It's improving that and expanding that area to help feed the community, not just provide more spaces to live. So
That's an
I
interesting
guess
point you
my
make,
next
though, because a lot of our ponds, were lost to being filled in for development, or being dredged for marinas, or, so yeah, that valuable estuary and nearshore area, um, after, um, Western colonization, that 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 line of thinking really did affect the fish ponds that were still around.
I want to talk a little bit bigger about how we can apply some of those lessons to more global environmental issues that are directly affecting coastal communities, like climate mitigation, invasive species, shifting species. Have you seen in the work that you've done, have you seen any marked changes in community resiliency in face of climatic change, or things that you've noticed that you think could affect global responses?
Um, I guess in terms of things we've seen, practitioners definitely in their lifetime have seen the water levels at extreme tides go over their walls in places that they had never witnessed before, or um, kind of like to an extent that they had never seen before. And some of these structures are like 600 to 800 years old, and maybe we're in the, I'd say, like second generation of practitioners working to restore these places and practices. And so for us to hear from people saying things like that, it um I think it shows what what we are going to be thinking about for the rest of our lifetimes, and then what we're trying to set in place um for the next generation to take this on. And so I think right now some of the things that um could inform practices elsewhere, at least for continued advocacy for indigenous practices and indigenous food systems. Um, I think a lot of people doing similar work, it might resonate with them that these places existed for hundreds of years because our ancestors were able to adapt them to change, and to allow for that to happen, and to enhance the resilience of these places and the communities that do this work. I think we need to find the policy avenues um, that will facilitate the adaptation that will be needed. And so, for an example, for fish ponds at least, a lot of the regulatory barriers have been around just the physical restoration of these places. So, having to get dredge and fill permits, or having to get even state level permits just to move rocks around and replace rocks that have fallen off of these places that are hundreds of years old and that have been there, and that you know folks have had to advocate for decades to say that there's no negative environmental impact, um, because we're restoring these places and because they were designed in a way to reduce negative environmental impact and to enhance the natural functioning of these habitats and enhance the natural productivity of these habitats. um, but so ways that policy can facilitate the adaptation of fish ponds is to push the boundary even further for those regulatory frameworks to allow practitioners to think about where a new fish pond is going to be built, or where are we going to need to adapt fish pond construction in the next generation, because our shorelines are obviously going to change, and the places where estuaries are is going to change, and they're going to shift based on the rising ocean levels, and then also changes in our freshwater flows to the ocean. And so what are the ways that the regulatory barriers can start to be chipped away at now, so that the next generation won't have to fight against these things to continue the practice that has existed for generations here in the islands. And so I think that applies in other places. Folks can identify ways to um, not just allow, but to encourage the continuation of these kinds of practices.
Has there been any talk about doing that through the local legislature, or is that not who you have to go through to get those permits? Is it Army Corps?
Um, yeah, so this has been something that's kind of been on the back burner for a while, but it's something that we want to continue to build momentum for. And maybe it's just also that we're kind of like trying to not build a case, but demonstrate the work of practitioners that is happening, and kind of like show that there is potential for fish pond practice to continue, and to even like grow in new ways that we couldn't have imagined decades ago. But yeah, currently for dredging, for example, folks have to get permits through the Army Corps. But I'm sure other indigenous kind of food system practice and this is part of it too, kind of building our network with other nations in other tribal nations in the United States. Um, but to build a case for maybe there's some kind of like indigenous food production or food infrastructure like exemption or like a special category to facilitate the construction of indigenous infrastructure such as fish ponds and other kinds of food production. Um, but yeah, that's kind of been something that we want to build more collective energy around.
Yeah, I love that idea. That sounds really cool and meaningful and sensible. Um, so I'm gonna rejigger my questions here a little bit because I want to talk about food security because I feel like that's sort of coming up. Can you talk a little bit about how food sovereignty and security have changed for the indigenous people in Hawaii and the communities there?
A long history of disrupted land tenure and disruption in the um, like the political framework that allowed for traditional land and resource management. Um, and so because of that, there are a lot of threads that lead to displacement from land, um, reduced access to land, um, reduced access or actually really displacement of freshwater resources for farming and freshwater resources also for nearshore production. So like we mentioned earlier, fish ponds really relied on that brackish water environment and so the fresh water coming down from our watersheds in streams or in groundwater sources um, has definitely been impacted um, by the displacement of water for plantation agriculture and for development. Um, and so all those kinds of interconnected things have reduced people's ability to be food secure, not just for growing food, but then I think a lot of people, point to the statistics of like 80 to 90% of food for the general population here in the islands is imported. And so when we compare that to uh, a situation where prior to Western contact, the population here was just about 1 million people, and that was sustained for generations without significant import of, resources. I think it shows that these islands and these communities can be food secure, um, given the natural resources of, you know, the actual islands and the ocean. But it's not just uh, it's not just the physical lands and waters that have changed, but our social structures and our political infrastructure and our economic infrastructure has changed in ways um, that affect folks' ability to achieve food sovereignty and food security. Um, and so I think the kinds of work that people are doing in small scales, in their communities to restore fish ponds, to restore traditional agriculture systems, those are ways that they're rebuilding food sovereignty in their little communities, and then I think what Kua is really amazing at and what we are really lucky to do is connect those communities with each other so that they can empower each other and kind of build their collective power. even if they're separated by distance and across islands and often in rural places. So I think, but I think there is really a strong vision and will that's building across communities in Hawaii to build back the food sovereignty of the islands.
That's really just it's beautifully told. Thank you for sharing that. Um, it just sounds to me like you're bringing things back to the beginning and in order to restore them, because those infrastructural changes, all the cultural changes that you talked about, also would affect people's ability to engage with the caretakers of those ponds, and with the pond being a community resource, it would, you know, when the pond was lost, then that access is lost, and the memory of it is lost until it's brought back, and then you're starting from scratch. And this connection point that you're providing for these, for different caretakers and communities restoring their ponds is, it's really remarkable. Just so inspired by that work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing that. So on our tour, because we were lucky, very, very lucky to be able to see a fish pond in person, and that it's more than just one. You don't just go to a pond, you go to this network of ponds, right? And our guide there pointed out that fish ponds are not actually considered aquaculture. The fish are wild, and I got the impression that the distinction is that they're not fed, as traditional aquaculture would be fed. Can you talk about where and why this line might be drawn culturally?
The whole network might have different views on it, and really it's about how we interpret that word aquaculture, and the impressions that people have with the word aquaculture and what we understand aquaculture to be in our minds. So I think a lot of us probably think about aquaculture as like conventional modern aquaculture, maybe in tanks and with genetic modification and kind of breeding of fish in closed environments. And so in that sense, a lot of folks would say no, fish ponds aren't aquaculture because yeah, the fish are wild in the sense that juveniles, for most of the species, juveniles would be naturally recruited into the ponds when they're small, and then cultivated in the ponds in the sense that they're not physically fed food, but the maintenance of the health of the pond would facilitate the growth of algae that those herbivorous fish would eat. So they're not fed in the sense of like feeding them food, but they're fed in the sense of taking care of the habitat that would grow the food for us. Um, and so in that sense, maybe people feel like that's very different than what we understand as conventional aquaculture. And then also most fish ponds would have an exchange of their population with the wild fishery, in the sense that adults would often be released to spawn in the wild. Some fish ponds do observe spawning of certain species in the fish ponds, but for the most part, people um, point to the fact that the spawning of wild fish in the wild is what provides the recruits to stock the ponds. Um, so I think in a lot of different ways, the Loko operate differently than um, what folks would think of as conventional aquaculture. But, I'm still learning about what other forms of indigenous aquaculture are around the world. And I know that there are, fish traps and weirs and other forms of actual cultivation and land-based ponds maybe that are indigenous to other places around the world. And so I think the notion of cultivation um, is is a part of what locally a practice describes, because the word for say someone who works in fish ponds, the word mahi is used, mahi'i'a, and mahi is also used for mahi'ai, like a farmer, the cultivation of food, um and that phrase distinguishes from lava'i'a, from a fisherman, a word that's used for a fisher person. And so fish pond practice definitely is distinguished from wild capture. And I think it's because of that cultivation relationship. And so some people might say it's cultivation of the fish or cultivation of the environment, you know. Um, so yeah, I think it's just, you know, a distinction on definitions on what
Yeah.
aquaculture actually means. Yeah.
It sounds like that distinction that and that discussion that is made across the aquaculture industry as well. You know, it's always
Mm,
a matter of like how you personally define aquaculture or how
mm.
your community defines it and how you're interacting with the land and the natural resources. It's so fascinating. Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much, Brenda, for being with us here today. That's going to wrap up our conversation, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and share some of your work and your practices there in Hawaii.
Yeah, thanks for having me.